Chapter 10 is called Fairbanks. So we're back to McCandless's story again. Remember, we just left off chapter 8 and 9, where the author was comparing him and talking about other Alaskan adventurers who kind of have gone out and done the same thing as him. And remember, his purpose for doing that, Krakauer writes here, he says, like these other adventurists like Rossellini and Waterman, McCandless was a seeker and had an impractical fascination with the harsh side of nature. He displayed staggering common sense at times, and they just have this love of the wild. So that's why he was trying to show you other people do this all the time. Here are some of the traits they share, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, chapter 10, we're back to McCandless's story. If you remember when we last left off with the story of McCandless, he had left Carthage and he's headed into Alaska. Okay, here we go. This is an article that appeared in the New York Times. Anchorage, September 12th. Last Sunday, a young hiker stranded by an injury was found dead at a remote camp in the Alaskan interior. No one is yet certain who he was, but his diary and 2 notes found at the camp tell a wrenching story of his desperate and progressively futile efforts to survive. The diary indicates that the man, believed to be an American in his late 20s or early 30s, might have been injured in a fall and that he was then stranded at the camp for more than 3 months. It tells how he tried to save himself by hunting game and eating wild plants while nonetheless getting weaker. One of his 2 notes is a plea for help, addressed to anyone who might come upon the camp while the hikers search the surrounding area for food. The second note bids the world goodbye. An autopsy at the state coroner's office in Fairbanks this week found that the man had died of starvation, probably in late July. The authorities discovered among the man's possessions a name that they believe is his, but they have so far been unable to confirm his identity and, until they do, have declined to disclose the name. So this was written, obviously, a week or so after, in the New York Times, after they find McCandless's body. Now, there's a couple of issues with this note a little bit. They talk about him dying of starvation, which we'll get back to. They talk about him looking for plants and trying to survive off of hunting game. These are all things they cover in the last few chapters. They're called like the Stampede Trail. Coming up, the last few chapters in the book are all about what happens in Alaska to him. So I know like they keep like stringing you along a little bit because you're like, okay, tell us what happened when he was up there. But they're getting to that. You'll get to that. That's the good part of the story. They're building you up to it. All right, so here we go, guys. Oops. Okay. By the time the New York Times picked up the story about the hiker, the Alaska State Troopers had been trying for a week to figure out who he was. When he died, McCandless was wearing a blue sweatshirt printed with the logo of a Santa Barbara towing company. When contacted, the wrecking outfit professed to know nothing about him or how he'd acquired the shirt. Many of the entries in the brief, perplexing diary recovered with the body were terse observations of flora and fauna, which fueled speculation that McCandless was a field biologist, but that ultimately led nowhere too. So, by the way, he did a lot of research, which you find out about, looking at the types of things he could eat up there and how he could survive. So although a lot of people are like, he went up there totally unprepared, he did do a lot of research, okay? On September 10th, 3 days before news of the dead hiker appeared in the Times, the story was published on the front page of the Anchorage Daily News. When Jim Gallion saw the headline and the accompanying mat indicating that the body had been 25 miles west of Healy on the Stampede Trail, he felt the hairs bristle across the base of his scalp. Alex. Gallion still held a picture in his mind of the odd, congenial youth striding down the trail in boots. Oops, sorry guys. In boots 2 sizes too big for him. Gallion's own boots, the old brown extra toughs he'd persuaded the kid to take. From the newspaper article, what little information there was, it sounded like the same person, said Gallion. So I called the state troopers and said, hey, I think I gave that guy a ride. Remember Gallion, you guys? It's how the whole book starts, right? He's the last person he sees before he heads down the Stampede Trail. Gallion dropped him at the head of the Stampede Trail. Took his picture, he rides off, okay? Okay, sure, replied Trooper Roger Ellis, the cop on the other end of the line. What makes you think so? You're the sixth person in the last hour who's called to say they know the hiker's identity. But Gallion persisted, and the more he talked, the more Ellis's skepticism receded. Gallion described several pieces of equipment not mentioned in the newspaper account that matched gear found with the body. And then Ellis noticed that the first cryptic entry in the hiker's journal read, Exit Fairbanks, sitting Gallion, Rabbit Day. Oh, he's talking about Gallion picked him up to help him exit Fairbanks. The troopers had by this time developed the roll of film in the hiker's Minolta, which included several apparent self-portraits. When they brought the pictures out to the job site where I was working, said Gallion, there's no two ways about it. The guy in the pictures was Alex. But McCandless had told Gallion he was from South Dakota. The troopers immediately shifted their search there for the hiker's next of kin. An All Points bulletin turned up a missing person named McCandless from eastern South Dakota, coincidentally from a small town only 20 miles from Wayne Westerberg's home in Carthage, and for a while the troopers thought they'd found their man. But this too turned out to be a false lead. How coincidental is that, you guys? Remember he told everybody he was from South Dakota because he said that was what really felt like family to him and he meant to go back and live with them after Alaska. So they're looking in South Dakota for a McCandless who also is missing. Like, that's crazy. Okay. But anyways, it's a false lead. Westerberg had heard nothing from the friend he knew as Alex McCandless since receiving the postcard from Fairbanks the previous spring. On September 13th, he's rolling down an empty ribbon of blacktop outside Jamestown, North Dakota, leading his harvest crew home to Carthage after wrapping up the 4-month cutting season in Montana. When the VHP barked to life, those are like the car walkie-talkies, guys, before there were cell phones. Wayne, an anxious voice crackled over the radio from one of the crew's other trucks. This is Bob. You got your radio on? Yeah, Bobby, Wayne here. What's up? Quick, turn on your AM and listen to Paul Harvey. He's talking about some kid who starved to death up in Alaska. Police don't know who he is. Sounds a whole lot like Alex. Westerberg found the station in time to catch the tail end of a Paul Harvey broadcast, and he was forced to agree. The few sketchy details made the anonymous hiker sound distressingly like his friend. Paul Harvey was a news story, guys, and he would always say, and now the rest of the story. So he would always tell like stories kind of like this that were broadcast all over the U.S. It was a nationally syndicated show. As soon as he got to Carthage, a dispirited Westerberg phoned the Alaska State Troopers to volunteer what he knew about McCandless. By that time, however, stories about the dead hiker, including excerpts from his diary, had been given prominent play in newspapers across the country. As a consequence, the troopers were swamped with calls from people claiming to know the hiker's identity, so they were even less receptive to Westerberg than they had been to Gallion. The cop told me they'd had more than 150 calls from folks who thought Alex was their kid, their friend, their brother, says Westerberg. Well, by then, I was kind of pissed at getting the runaround, so I told them, look, I'm not just another crank caller. I know who he is. He worked for me. I think I've even got his social security number around here somewhere. Westerberg pawed through the files at the grain elevator until he found 2 W-4 forms McCandless had filled out. Across the top of the first one, dating from McCandless's initial visit to Carthage in 1990, he had scrawled, exempt, 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 and given his name as Iris, Address, none of your damn business. Social security number, I forget. Okay, I'm sorry, you guys. It is hilarious to me that he actually filled out a W-4 form like this, and the people in the office obviously never even look at those things because they never even saw how he filled it out. But on the second form, dated March 30th of 92, so this is the second time he went back to Carthage, 2 weeks before he left for Alaska, he'd signed his given name, Chris J. McCandless. And in the blank for social security number, he put down his real social security number. Westerberg phoned Alaska again. This time, the troopers took him seriously. The social security number turned out to be genuine and placed McCandless's permanent residence in Northern Virginia. Authorities in Alaska contacted law enforcement agencies in that state, who in turn started combing through directories for McCandlesses. Walt and Billy McCandless had by then moved to the Maryland shore and no longer had a Virginia phone number, but Walt's eldest child, from his first marriage, lived in Annandale, and he was in the book. Late on the afternoon of September 17th, Sam McCandless received a call from a Fairfax County homicide detective. Okay, when they're trying to figure out who this guy is, you guys have to remember something, okay? They're not in like 2020, okay? They don't have, back in the early 90s, like computer information and logs and stuff like we have now, where you'd be able to go online and figure this out. Everything was paper phone books, right? And trying landlines and stuff like that. So I know some people are like, how can they not figure out who this guy is? Like, this has to be way easier. But just remember the technology, the differences there was in the early 90s to right now. They didn't have the resources we did. This would be a lot faster today. Sam, 9 years older than Chris, had seen a short article about the hiker in the Washington Post a few days earlier. But, he allows, it didn't occur to me that the hiker might be Chris. Never even crossed my mind. It's ironic because when I read the article, I thought, oh my God, what a terrible tragedy. I feel really sorry for the family of this guy, whoever they are. What a sad story. Sam had been raised in California and Colorado in his mother's household and hadn't moved to Virginia until 1987, after Chris had left the state to attend college in Atlanta, so Sam didn't know his half-brother well. But when the homicide detective started asking whether the hiker sounded like anyone he knew, Sam reports, I was pretty sure it was Chris. The fact that he'd gone to Alaska, that he'd gone off by himself, it all added up. At the detective's request, Sam went to the Fairfax County Police Department, where an officer showed him a photograph of the hiker that had been faxed from Fairbanks. It was an 8x10 enlargement, Sam recalls, a headshot. His hair was long, he'd had a beard. Chris almost always had short hair and was clean-shaven, and the face in the picture was extremely gaunt. But I knew right away. There was no doubt. It was Chris. I went home, picked up Michelle, my wife, and drove out to Maryland to tell Dad and Billy. I didn't know what I was going to say. How do you tell someone that their child is dead? All right, guys, and so now what happens, see, chapter 11 here is titled Chesapeake Beach. For chapters 11, 12, and 13, they go into Chris's childhood. They go back to his mom, Billy, and his dad, Walt, and they're like, what their home life was like, what this relationship was like, what telling them was like, how his sister Corinne, who he was so close to, how she takes the news. So chapter 11, 12, and 13 are all about like his background, his childhood, his family, and you get revealed some interesting info here. So far, if some people are like, how could some kid wander off and do this to his family? Like they raised him and loved him. Who could do that? Oh, you find out some interesting info here about his family in the next few chapters, okay? So the way the book plays out, because you're more than halfway there, you guys, okay? So the way the book plays out is the next few chapters are about his home life, and then finally they're like, okay, so here's how he wound up in Alaska, and here's what happened on the Stampede Trail. So they save like the whole Alaska part for the end, so you see what happened to him when he was up there and everything. So you just got to stay with it through the next few chapters, see what happened in his childhood that would kind of motivate him to want to live this kind of life and go off to Alaska like he did and everything. And it's kind of an interesting story. But that's all that's left, you guys. Couple chapters on his childhood, what happens in Alaska, and you're done. All right, so we'll pick up there next week.